Paul, on the back of the previous conversation around why social enterprise is not a not-for-profit,
Yeah.
you started to touch on some of the myths that exist in the space. It would be good if we could tease one of those out today, being that there is no profit in a not-for-profit. Could you talk to us a bit about what you mean when you say that?
So I guess if we go back to what the definition of profit is in the first place. So in very layman's terms, it's quite simple. Profit is when you have more money come in than you spend. And even from a household budget, you know that if you have less money come in than you spend, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
So any organisation, any family actually has to be somewhat profitable, break even at worst, but profit is a really important part of saving for the future, of having margin and being able to soak up and being agile. So when things happen in an environment, you can react to them. So it's a bit of a myth to say that not-for-profits are not for profit. They are all profitable. They all have to be profitable in order to carry out what they do. I think the other myth that goes with that is that sometimes they think that the profit is what's being spent to carry out the activity. And I think that's a little bit of a misnomer, can we edit that, as well. Because what actually happens is you're selling a donor promise. So most not-for-profits, whether it's a donation or whether it's a general public donation, you're selling something. So even when you go for a grant, you're selling something. And you have to deliver on that promise. So profit is really only over and above what it costs you to deliver whatever you've promised to deliver.
Yeah.
But all organisations need that level of profit. Sometimes it goes into admin, but sometimes it needs to go into other things like building up a good capital base that you can work off, buying long-term capital equipment, or whatever else it may be. So it's not that not-for-profits are not for profit, they're very much for profit. It's how they use the profit that's actually really important. Again, the focus can end up being on the profit and not on what all the dollars are spent on.
And that was kind of where I was then wanting to go, because again, there does seem to be an obsession with what do you do with your profit, and when that's tends to be such a small percentage, what are some of the consequences of that obsession and what that drives in behaviour?
And there's quite a lot of definitions around social enterprise that actually talk about, well, you have to invest a certain amount of your profits back into the business. Every business invests back into their business, otherwise you're not going to succeed.
Yeah.
So once we take the assumption that you are profitable, you are earning more than you're spending, how you use those profits, while important, if the focus is just on those profits, you end up driving some really bad behaviour. A number of those can be. First and foremost is that really you can create any kind of profit you like in a business. All you have to do is adjust salaries and what you're paying out, etc. And so particularly for a social entrepreneur, the obsession with creating a fantastic organisation then can be driven down an incorrect path where you can't use all of your profits, or you can't distribute profits, you can't use the profits to acquire more capital, so you might as well just pay yourself more.
Yeah.
So you can artificially create lots of profit, or you can actually pay yourself more, or pay others more, pay other expenses. And I see this quite acutely when it comes to the difference between paying a loan and paying for equity. So generally speaking, when you think about profit, you think about paying for loan money, debt that you owe, and interest first, before the profit's calculated. And so people think that's okay. So if I borrow $100,000 and pay $10,000 worth of interest on that, that's okay for a not-for-profit to do because it's before profit. However, if I do the same thing and get $100,000 of equity, somebody's putting in at risk, and they'll get part of the profit if the organisation succeeds. Somehow that's not seen as good. Yeah. It's almost seen as dirty, or something's wrong with that. Yeah. And yet it's a different way of accessing capital, it's just that it comes out of the profit. Yeah. And that person's taking the risk with you. Yeah. Whereas a loan generally is not taking the same kind of risk.
And I think that some of that probably purely comes back to what we're familiar with. So we're used to a bank and having to pay interest. And yet because of some of these differences and obsession with profit or not for profit, you then see, oh, well, the investor's being greedy, or they can't, it's not justifiable for them to take a return. Whereas as you're saying, comparison with that bank loan actually shows that it's exactly the same. in terms of its impact on what you can still deliver as an organisation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and in fact, it's even less impact when it is an equity piece.
True, because they're taking the risk. It's only if there is a return, well, if there is profit in the mix.
If there is profit in the mix, then you can pay some of it.
So in fact, that's one of those arguments that you've been making around equity being a nice piece for a social enterprise as an alternative to simply just the debt finance piece. Yeah.
And it's a normal part of how you would build out an enterprise. There are different stages where you use different types of capital. And I know we've had this conversation before, but that whole point that particularly not-for-profits and social enterprises, they don't have the kind of capacity to invest in infrastructure and capital building, unlike many of the not-for-profits of the kind of 80s, 90s and even before that, where they weren't under the same kind of scrutiny about how much was actually spent on the program, and so much more was able to be invested. So in order to build the kind of large-scale social mission-driven organisations, we are going to need to make that kind of investment. Well, where do you get that capital from? So you can borrow it from a bank, which generally is quite crippling on a early stage organisation to be paying loans back. If you're doing it as an equity piece where the person is more patient about getting their return, taking a greater risk, then it is a way, not the only, but a way of funding the capital requirements of a business.
It's one of the other things that I think we've seen as a consequence of this focus on profit, or what you do with the profit, is that, as well as the point you made that you can actually make profit look however you choose, there's also, I think, and maybe this is a risk for younger entrepreneurs, because there is this social responsibility to talk about what you're doing with your profits. Instead of actually waiting till the organisation is sustainable, is built, is comfortably, is operating well and has what it needs to, on an ongoing basis, continue to operate, prematurely there's a jump to do something good with the profit and give away what really, for a longer term impact, probably should have been reinvested into the business. And so there's also some issues around that, I would think.
Well, sometimes I think that profit is seen as the part that I can do good with.
Exactly.
And so what gets missed is that, let's say, most businesses, if they're doing 10 or 20% profit, they're doing very, very well with their revenues. So let's just work on 10%. If an organisation is making 10% profit, that's only 10% of the money they expend every year. So the first question has to be, what are they doing with the first 90%? And not just saying, well, it's great, we're a great organisation because we give away 50% of our profit, or, we give away all of our profit, or a percentage of our profit. Profit for me is exactly that. It's the little savings plan that allows you to reinvest, allows you to potentially leverage up other capital, but it's not the core business. And I think the story that social enterprise can tell is not, this is what we do with our profit. It's actually, this is what we do with every dollar within the organisation.
Well, because otherwise what's the difference between any business that then has a CSR component or some aspect where you're giving back in some way?
Correct.
Are there other aspects, again, just focusing on that first myth around there being no profit? Are there any other things that you see coming out of that myth?
Well, I think one of the things that happens, particularly in the not-for-profit sector, is that sense that we should never generate or ask for a grant or get income that's in excess of what the exact program requirements are. And so you end up with that barbecue stopping question that not-for-profit and NGO leaders always get: how much goes on overhead? And so often when grantors come, they go, well, we're happy to fund the program, but we don't want to fund your overhead. And part of that's because it's not a for-profit mentality. I think mission-driven not-for-profits should actually be profit-driven, because the more profit they can make, they're demonstrating value over and above their single product delivery. But they also then don't think about all the costs that actually go into delivery of the program. So now there's this gap between what you've promised to deliver or sell and how much it actually costs to run the organisation. And so lots of organisations spend a significant amount of time trying to work out how to fund the gap, the administrative and overhead gap. But that's actually a cost which is part of the program. And when you think in a not-for-profit way, often it drives you right down that end of the chain as well, but would just work out the cost of the program.
and try to make that look as little as possible.
Yes.
And,
Yep, strip it out, put very little margin in, and really not allow for failure. So if you've got a failure over here, one of the things profit does for you is spreads risk. Because if you have a profitable organisation, you can afford for some of your programs not to work as well and actually cover that risk as well.
Excellent. I think we might leave that myth there, and
Okay.
we'll touch on some more in the next conversation.
Thanks, Bessie.